Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in China in the past 24 hours. Today, the big China story is not simply another military demonstration. It is about Beijing increasingly using every tool of national power at the same time: strategic weapons, maritime pressure, economic leverage, and diplomatic positioning. The latest developments show a China that is trying to shape the environment around it before a crisis ever begins. An update on the submarine-launched missile test we discussed previously. The immediate regional reaction has continued to grow, with more focus now shifting toward what the launch means for China's broader strategic posture. The missile test was a demonstration of capability, but the bigger issue for U.S. allies is the combination of that capability with China's expanding presence throughout the Indo-Pacific. The test involved a long-range ballistic missile launched from a nuclear-powered submarine into the Pacific Ocean. Beijing described it as routine training and emphasized that it was not aimed at any specific country. But the fact that China chose to publicly acknowledge the launch matters. For decades, Beijing was far more cautious about revealing details of its nuclear forces. Now it is increasingly willing to showcase systems that demonstrate a more advanced and survivable nuclear capability. The strategic goal appears aimed largely at Washington. China wants U.S. policymakers to factor in the possibility that any conflict involving Taiwan or another major regional dispute could escalate into a much broader confrontation. A submarine-based nuclear force is central to that calculation because it gives a country the ability to maintain a retaliatory capability even if other forces are targeted. The reaction from regional governments has also moved beyond the missile itself and toward concerns about transparency and predictability. Australia, Japan, and New Zealand all raised concerns about the short notice provided before the launch. Australian officials specifically pointed to the broader challenge of understanding China's military intentions as Beijing continues expanding its capabilities. At the same time, Australia is moving to strengthen its own regional security network. Canberra and Fiji recently signed the Ocean of Peace Alliance, creating a mutual defense commitment between the two countries. The agreement is significant because it marks Fiji's first formal alliance and expands Australia's network of security partnerships in the Pacific. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese described the agreement as a commitment that an attack on Fiji would trigger Australian support. The treaty also creates a framework for additional Pacific nations to participate in the future. The timing of this agreement is important because it reflects the larger competition playing out across the Pacific Islands. China has spent years expanding economic and diplomatic relationships across the region, while Australia and its partners are increasingly focused on ensuring Beijing does not gain exclusive influence or security access. Solomon Islands remains a particularly interesting example of that competition. The country has maintained close ties with China since signing a security agreement with Beijing in 2022, but Solomon Islands Prime Minister Matthew Whale criticized China's missile test, saying that being a friend does not mean supporting actions that increase regional tensions. Now, shifting back toward Taiwan, one of the most important developments is how China is expanding pressure beyond traditional military exercises. Chinese Coast Guard and government vessels have continued operating east of Taiwan, moving into areas where Beijing previously maintained a much smaller presence. This is significant because these operations are designed less around immediate military action and more around establishing a pattern. The idea is familiar: create a presence, repeat the claim, and gradually make that activity appear normal. Chinese maritime law enforcement activity east of Taiwan gives Beijing another tool to assert control narratives around the island. It also places Chinese government vessels closer to strategically important areas involving commercial shipping routes, undersea infrastructure, and waters relevant to submarine operations. Taiwan is responding by tracking these activities more closely. Officials have said Chinese naval movements have increased during the current exercise season, with multiple Chinese formations operating across the Western Pacific. Taiwan's military also continues monitoring regular Chinese air and maritime activity around the island. The concern in Taipei is not one individual event. It is the accumulation of pressure. Repeated operations, expanded patrol patterns, and growing government vessel presence create a more complex security environment where miscalculation becomes more likely. China is also continuing to apply pressure through economic tools, particularly against Japan. Beijing's restrictions on rare earth exports are becoming a larger concern for Japanese companies. These materials are essential for advanced manufacturing, electric vehicles, electronics, and defense-related industries. Japanese companies have increasingly warned investors that prolonged restrictions could create supply chain problems. This is another example of how economic leverage has become part of China's broader strategic toolkit. Beijing does not need to use military force to create pressure. Control over critical resources can provide another avenue for influence. Meanwhile, China and Russia are continuing to deepen military cooperation. The two countries launched joint C-2026 naval exercises near Qingdao, involving naval coordination, reconnaissance, air and missile defense training, and at-sea operations. Both governments describe the drills as defensive and not directed against any other country. But regional governments are watching the pattern, not just the individual exercise. The significance comes from repeated interaction between the Chinese and Russian militaries, particularly in maritime environments where both countries want to challenge U.S. and allied influence. For Beijing, cooperation with Moscow provides another way to demonstrate that it is not operating alone. For Russia, these exercises reinforce its ability to remain strategically relevant in the Indo-Pacific, despite its continued focus on Europe. The broader picture is that China's competition with the United States and its allies is increasingly multidimensional. The missile launch sends a nuclear deterrence message. Coast Guard operations around Taiwan reinforce territorial claims. Rare earth restrictions create economic pressure. Naval exercises with Russia demonstrate partnership. None of these actions individually changes the regional balance overnight, but together they show a country working across multiple lanes at once, trying to increase influence, shape perceptions, and make its preferred security environment the new normal. Thank you for listening and for contributing to the growth of this community. If you found the show valuable, a review or a thoughtful comment helps extend its reach to others. For more in-depth analysis, we publish a daily intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, covering Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Take care and have a great day.